The morning the sea was too calm did not announce itself with drama, nor did it arrive with any sense that it would one day be remembered. It came softly, like a held breath, with the horizon stretched wide and pale under a sky that had decided to be gentle, the kind of sky sailors trusted without thinking, where the light slid across the water in slow silver bands and the ocean seemed to rock itself into a thoughtful stillness, neither asleep nor awake, just present, endlessly present, as if it had nowhere else to be. The ship that would notice this calm first did so without words, without fear, without any understanding that calmness can sometimes be more unsettling than storms. Her hull cut through the water politely, barely disturbing the surface, as if the sea had granted her permission to pass, and the air around her carried no urgency, only the faint scent of salt and sun-warmed wood. Somewhere above, seabirds traced lazy circles, their cries distant and unhurried, and the sunlight fell evenly across deck planks that had already memorized the rhythm of days at sea, days that blended into one another until time itself felt softened by repetition. This was a morning that encouraged routine, the checking of ropes, the quiet walk from bow to stern, the small human habits that made vast spaces feel manageable. And yet there was something about the stillness that lingered a second too long, like a pause that did not quite know how to end. The waves did not argue with the ship, did not slap or pull or insist. They merely rolled beneath her, slow and patient, as if waiting for something to be acknowledged. Even the wind, that restless companion of sailors, had chosen restraint, touching sails with the lightest suggestion rather than a command, letting canvas breathe instead of billow, and in that restraint there was a curious intimacy, a sense that the sea was listening rather than speaking. Morning light revealed everything clearly, the grain of wood, the quiet gleam of metal, the subtle sway of shadows. And yet clarity did not bring comfort, because clarity without movement has a way of feeling unfinished, like a sentence left without a period. If there were men aboard, this would have been the hour when they stood quietly with cups warming their hands, gazing outward not because they expected answers but because looking at the sea had become a habit, a way of aligning the mind with something larger and steadier than thought. The ocean, after all, was good at absorbing worries without returning them. And yet, beneath that surface calm, the sea carried its long memory, a memory older than names and maps, a memory that did not concern itself with explanations or conclusions, only with continuity. The horizon remained unbroken, a thin line where sky and water agreed to meet without merging, and in that agreement there was a quiet tension, as if both sides understood that what lay between them was a space where things could happen without witnesses. The ship moved on, obedient to its course, unaware that mornings like this sometimes mark the boundary between the ordinary and the inexplicable, that they feel peaceful precisely because nothing has yet asked to be understood. The deck absorbed sunlight and silence in equal measure, the kind of silence that does not echo but settles, spreading evenly, filling corners and cabins and the small spaces behind the eyes where thoughts slowed down. Somewhere below, objects rested exactly where they had been left, cups waiting for hands, shoes waiting for feet, tools waiting for purpose. Each item confident that it would soon be used, that continuity was a promise rather than a question. The sea did not contradict this confidence. It supported it with its gentlest movements, rocking the ship like a cradle, not to put it to sleep but to reassure it that motion itself could be tender. Time passed without insistence, measured not in minutes but in light shifting slightly along the rails, in shadows shortening almost imperceptibly, and in that slow passage there was room for reflection, for the subtle human tendency to feel that all was well simply because nothing was wrong. Yet calm, when stretched thin, begins to reveal its own weight. It presses softly, asking the mind to notice it, to wonder why the world has chosen quiet so completely. This was not the calm that follows a storm, earned and exhausted, nor the calm before one, tense and anticipatory. This was a calm that seemed to exist for its own sake, self-contained, uninterested in explanation, and perhaps that was what made it feel unfamiliar. The ship continued forward, unaware that this particular morning would one day be spoken of in hushed tones, that its stillness would be replayed in the imaginations of those who would later search for meaning in silence. For now, there was only the sea, smooth and reflective, holding the sky like a thought held gently in the mind, and the unremarkable beauty of a day that asked nothing and promised nothing, a day that seemed to say without words, that not all mysteries begin with noise, that some arrive quietly, disguised as peace, drifting in on a horizon that looks exactly the way it always has. The morning arrived without urgency, slipping into existence the way a thought does just before waking, when the world feels distant yet strangely attentive, and the sea, vast, patient, endlessly rehearsed, had chosen an unusual restraint, lying open and smooth beneath the sky as if it were holding something fragile and did not wish to disturb it. Sunlight spread slowly across the water, not in sharp flashes but in a softened glow that turned the horizon into a pale ribbon, neither fully defined nor entirely blurred, a line that seemed less like a boundary and more like an agreement between sky and sea to remain calm together. The ship moved through this stillness with an almost apologetic grace, its hull gliding rather than cutting, leaving behind only the faintest suggestion of a wake, as though even the water preferred not to remember its passing. There was nothing dramatic in the air, no warning cry from the wind, no tension in the ropes, no nervous creak from the timbers, only the familiar scent of salt and aged wood warming under the sun, a smell that belonged to routine, to days that passed safely and nights that returned predictably. Seabirds floated overhead in wide, unhurried arcs, their wings barely moving, as if effort itself had been temporarily suspended, and their distant calls felt less like communication and more like punctuation in an otherwise uninterrupted silence. This was the kind of morning that invited habit. The quiet walk along the deck, the checking of sails that did not argue with the wind, the small gestures sailors repeated not because they were necessary in that moment but because repetition brought comfort in a world too large to fully understand. And yet, beneath the familiarity, there was a subtle wrongness, not sharp enough to alarm but persistent enough to be noticed by the part of the mind that listens when everything else has gone quiet. The sea did not shimmer with energy or pulse with movement. It simply existed, calm to the point of indifference, rocking the ship with a motion so gentle it felt less like travel and more like being held in place. Shadows lay lazily across the deck, stretching and retreating with the slow discipline of time, and the light revealed everything without judgment. The neatly coiled ropes, the smooth rails worn down by countless hands, the quiet corners where nothing stirred, offering clarity without reassurance. Somewhere below deck, objects waited with unquestioned faith in continuity. A cup that expected to be lifted, a jacket draped where a body would soon reach for it, a pair of boots angled just so, confident that footsteps would return. The stillness allowed these ordinary details to feel unusually vivid, as if the absence of distraction had sharpened perception, and with that sharpness came a faint unease, the sense that noticing too much can be as unsettling as noticing too little. The wind brushed against the sails only in suggestion, enough to remind the ship that movement was possible but not enough to insist upon it, and in that restraint there was something intimate, almost conspiratorial, as though the sea were choosing its gentlest voice on purpose. Time drifted rather than passed, measured not by clocks but by the slow migration of light and the subtle shift of warmth across the planks, and within that drifting, the mind began to wander in ways it rarely did during busier hours. Calm has a way of inviting thought, of creating space where questions can stretch out comfortably, and yet this calm seemed to resist questions, offering no contrast, no disturbance against which curiosity could sharpen itself. The horizon remained steady and unbroken, a perfect line that refused to reveal depth or distance, and staring at it too long produced the peculiar sensation that the ship was not moving at all, that it was suspended in a painted scene where change had been politely postponed. The ocean carried its ancient memory beneath that glassy surface, a memory unconcerned with human schedules or expectations, and though it gave no sign of it, there was a weight to that memory, a quiet confidence that not everything needed to be explained in order to continue. This was not the calm that follows violence, nor the stillness that precedes it. It was something more neutral and therefore more unsettling, a pause without context, a silence that did not feel empty so much as deliberately full. Even the ship seemed to sense it, responding with a steadiness that bordered on reverence, every gentle sway feeling intentional, measured, as if movement itself were being rationed. The air was warm but not heavy, clear but not crisp, resting against skin without making demands, and breathing felt slower here, deeper, as though the body were unconsciously adapting to the pace of the world around it. Nothing asked for attention, and yet attention was difficult to withdraw because when the world offers no noise, the mind begins to search for meaning in texture, in light, in the faint sound of water folding back into itself. Somewhere in that search lived the quiet realization that mornings like this are often remembered not for what happens during them, but for what follows, for the way their calmness lingers in memory like a question that never quite forms. The ship continued on its path, obedient and unthinking, trusting charts and stars and the long-standing agreement between sailors and the sea, unaware that this particular stillness would one day be revisited, dissected, and whispered about as the beginning of something that refused to name itself. For now, there was only the soft insistence of the present moment, the gentle rocking that suggested safety, and the deceptive comfort of a world that appeared, in every visible way, to be perfectly at peace, even as it quietly prepared to keep its secrets. The longer one remained aboard the Mary Celeste, the clearer it became that the true story was not written in what was missing, but in what had been left behind, because absence alone can feel abstract, while objects carry weight, memory, and intention. And here those objects rested with a calm confidence that quietly refused to cooperate with fear. Every corner of the ship seemed to hold a paused moment, as though time itself had been gently asked to wait, and had agreed without protest. A cup stood near the table, empty but clean, placed there not in carelessness but in routine, the kind of placement done without thought, which made it all the more unsettling, because routine implies expectation, and expectation implies return. Nearby, plates were stacked neatly, not abandoned mid-meal, but set aside as if someone had finished eating and intended to continue the day. Clothing hung where it belonged, not hurriedly grabbed, not torn or scattered, but folded or draped with the unconscious orderliness of people who did not believe they were leaving for long. Even the personal items spoke softly of normalcy, a pipe resting unused, a pair of boots aligned as though their owner disliked disorder, a coat folded carefully, suggesting not panic but patience. The logbook, too, contributed its quiet voice, its entries steady and unremarkable, recording weather and position with the calm discipline of a man doing his job well, right up until the moment the writing stopped, not trailing into confusion but ending cleanly, as if the final sentence had been completed and the rest intentionally postponed. There was no farewell written here, no warning or confession, only an interruption so clean it felt purposeful, and that purpose, whatever it was, remained locked away, inaccessible to those who could only read the ink and not the moment. Moving through the cabins revealed more of the same unsettling order. Beds unrumpled beyond use, chests closed, valuables untouched, money left behind as if it had lost all meaning in a world where continuity itself had quietly dissolved. The cargo remained secured, the ship itself seaworthy and prepared, its structure betraying no sign of catastrophe or urgent departure. And this preservation of readiness made the emptiness feel heavier, because it suggested that whatever removed the people had not damaged the vessel, had not needed to. The lifeboat, however, was gone, and its absence did not scream but whispered, hinting at a choice made rather than a disaster suffered, yet even that choice felt incomplete, because nothing else aligned with desperation. There were no hastily packed bags, no evidence of supplies gathered, no signs that anyone expected to be gone long enough to require them, and so the lifeboat's absence opened questions rather than answers, its silence louder for the lack of context. The navigation instruments were intact, the maps carefully stored, the compass undisturbed, all of it reinforcing the sense that knowledge had not failed, that direction had not been lost, that the sea itself had not forced a decision through violence. Even the ship's clock ticked on, faithful and unaware, measuring time for no one, marking minutes that slipped past without witnesses, its persistence a quiet reminder that the world does not pause simply because people disappear. The sounds aboard were minimal yet intimate, the soft creak of wood adjusting to the water, the distant hush of waves against the hull, the whisper of wind threading through rigging, all familiar sounds that should have been accompanied by footsteps and voices, but now existed alone, unclaimed. Each object seemed to insist that it belonged to someone who would return, and that insistence created a strange emotional pull, a sense of trespass not because anything was private but because everything was personal. The ship did not feel abandoned in anger or fear. It felt abandoned in trust, as if those who left believed the ship would wait for them, would remain exactly as they had left it, patient and forgiving. That belief, if it existed, had been honored by the Mary Celeste, which drifted on without complaint, preserving the arrangement of lives mid-motion, carrying the memory of hands and habits across open water. The sea outside offered no commentary, no sign that it had witnessed anything unusual, its surface calm and reflective, unwilling to betray the moment when routine fractured. Standing among these remnants, it became difficult to imagine a dramatic explanation, because drama leaves scars, and here there were none. Instead, there was only the gentle discomfort of things that made too much sense in a situation that made none. The mind searched for patterns, for clues hidden in placement or absence, but the ship resisted interpretation, offering consistency rather than contradiction, normalcy rather than chaos. Even the children's belongings, small, carefully kept items that suggested care and continuity, rested quietly, amplifying the emotional weight of the scene without offering direction, reminding any observer that lives had been paused here, not erased, their momentum interrupted without explanation. The longer the gaze lingered, the more the ship seemed less like a crime scene and more like a still life painting, carefully composed, every element deliberate, inviting contemplation rather than conclusion. This was not a space that demanded action. It demanded patience, a willingness to sit with uncertainty and acknowledge that not all stories resolve themselves into clarity. As the hours passed, The realization settled in that the Mary Celeste was not merely a ship missing its crew, but a vessel carrying the evidence of ordinary life continuing right up until it did not, and that this quiet boundary between presence and absence was where the true mystery lived. When those who boarded her eventually stepped back onto their own ship, they carried with them no answers, only impressions, and the unsettling understanding that sometimes the most haunting stories are told not by what happened, but by what almost certainly should have happened next and never did. Once the silence of the Mary Celeste had been fully absorbed, once her untouched rooms and patiently waiting objects had impressed themselves upon memory, the human mind did what it has always done when faced with an absence too large to sit with comfortably. It began to invent explanations, each one rising like a wave, confident for a moment, before collapsing back into uncertainty. Theories arrived quietly at first, tentative and respectful, as if aware they were guests aboard a ship that did not ask for interpretation. And yet each theory carried with it the unmistakable urgency of the human need to close open endings. Perhaps it had been pirates, some suggested, their sudden arrival forcing the crew away without leaving marks of violence, yet the ship bore no sign of struggle, no ransacking, no hurried chaos, and the valuable cargo sat undisturbed, unimpressed by such an idea. Others spoke of mutiny, of simmering tensions that finally broke the surface, but mutiny leaves disorder behind, and here there was only order, careful and intact, as though cooperation rather than conflict had governed the final moments. Some turned their thoughts to natural causes, a sudden storm, a rogue wave, a threat invisible but immediate, yet the sea itself offered no evidence, no scars on the ship, no damage to her structure, and the logbook recorded nothing more alarming than ordinary weather, its calm entries refusing to dramatize the moment. Then there were theories that leaned into chemistry and chance, whispers of fumes from the cargo, of invisible dangers that might have prompted a temporary evacuation. A decision made quickly but calmly, with the expectation of return, and this idea lingered longer than most because it explained the lifeboat without demanding panic. Yet even this explanation felt incomplete because if the danger had passed, why had no one come back? Why had the ship continued on alone, carrying the memory of that decision across open water? Each possibility seemed plausible until it was placed gently against the evidence, and then it softened, lost its edge, and slipped quietly away. Theories, it turned out, behaved much like the sea itself, constantly moving, endlessly reshaping, but rarely settling into something solid enough to stand upon. Over time, these explanations accumulated not as answers, but as layers, each one revealing more about the people proposing them than about the event itself, because every theory carried the shape of the fear it was meant to soothe. Some feared violence and imagined attackers. Others feared nature and imagined storms. Still others feared the unseen and gave shape to dangers that could not be proven or disproven. And as years passed, these theories traveled far beyond the deck of the ship, carried into books, conversations, quiet late-night thoughts, each retelling smoothing rough edges, filling gaps with confidence that felt earned through repetition rather than truth. The Mary Celeste became less a ship and more a mirror, reflecting humanity's discomfort with unanswered questions, its reluctance to accept that an ending could exist without explanation. Yet for all the stories layered upon her, the ship herself remained unchanged in memory, orderly, intact, silent, unmoved by the weight of speculation. There was something almost instructive in the way every theory failed gently rather than dramatically, not collapsing under scrutiny but simply losing momentum, as though the mystery itself resisted being pinned down, not out of hostility but out of indifference. The sea, after all, does not explain itself. It moves, it holds, it releases, and it does not feel obligated to clarify its reasons. In this way, the Mary Celeste seemed to have absorbed something of the ocean's nature, becoming a lesson in restraint, in the limits of knowing. Theories rose and sank again, until their motion felt familiar, almost comforting, because motion, even circular motion, is easier to live with than stillness. And yet, beneath the constant churn of explanation, the original silence remained untouched, like a deep current running far below the surface where speculation could not reach. The ship's story resisted conclusion not because it was complex, but because it was simple in a way that denied satisfaction. People left, the ship remained, and the reasons were never recorded. Over time, some began to understand that the persistence of the mystery was not a failure of investigation, but a feature of the event itself, an invitation to reconsider the expectation that every story owes us closure. The Mary Celeste did not drift into legend because of what happened aboard her, but because of what did not, because her quiet defiance of narrative comfort forced those who encountered her story to sit with uncertainty longer than they wished. In the end, the theories mattered less than the realization they led to, that explanation is a human habit, not a universal rule, and that some moments pass through the world leaving behind only the evidence of their passing, not the meaning. The ship continued to exist in memory as it had on the water, steady, intact, uninterested in the stories told about it, carrying its unanswered questions not as a burden, but as part of its structure, as natural and inseparable as wood and sail. And as each theory finally sank beneath the surface of certainty, what remained was not frustration, but a quieter understanding, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only revisited, like waves returning again and again to the same shore, each time reshaping the sand, never explaining why. After the theories had exhausted themselves, after explanations had risen and fallen like obedient tides, there came a quieter phase in the story of the Mary Celeste, one not marked by investigation or debate, but by listening, as if those who lingered longest with the mystery eventually realized that answers were not approaching from the horizon, and so turned instead toward the sound of the water itself. Listening to the ocean required a different posture of mind, one less concerned with resolution and more open to presence. And in that posture the ship's silence began to feel less like defiance and more like invitation. The sea had always been speaking, after all, long before charts and logbooks attempted to translate it, speaking in rhythms rather than sentences, in repetition rather than explanation, and when one listened closely enough, it became clear that the Mary Celeste had not interrupted that conversation but joined it. The gentle slap of waves against the hull, the slow creak of timber adjusting to motion, the steady breathing of wind through rigging, these sounds formed a language older than inquiry, one that did not promise clarity but offered continuity. To listen was to accept that not everything arrives with meaning neatly attached, that some events simply exist, like the ocean itself, vast and indifferent yet deeply affecting. Those who sat with the story long enough began to notice how the mystery softened when held gently, how fear dissolved when not fed by urgency, how curiosity could become contemplative rather than restless. The ship no longer felt like a problem to be solved, but like a moment to be understood emotionally rather than intellectually, a reminder that human experience is not limited to what can be explained. The Mary Celeste, adrift yet composed, mirrored the way the ocean carries countless untold stories beneath its surface, each one layered upon the next, none demanding to be surfaced all at once. In listening, there was comfort, a realization that the absence of answers did not equal the absence of meaning, that mystery itself could be a form of depth rather than a failure of knowledge. The sea did not rush to fill the silence, nor did it attempt to justify itself. It simply continued, wave after wave, holding space for whatever drifted upon it. And in that holding, the ship's story began to feel less tragic and more reflective, less about loss and more about the limits of understanding. Listening meant allowing the unanswered to remain unanswered without tension, letting the story breathe as it was, unfinished yet complete in its own way. It meant recognizing that the ocean does not operate on human timelines, that what feels unresolved to us may simply be ongoing in a form we cannot access. The Mary Celeste, in this light, became not a symbol of abandonment but of transition, a vessel caught between moments, between presence and absence, between knowing and letting go. The calm that surrounded her was no longer unsettling. It was instructive, teaching patience through repetition, acceptance through scale. When one listens to the sea long enough, the desire for sharp conclusions softens, replaced by an appreciation for patterns that do not resolve but endure. The ocean does not explain why waves form. It simply forms them again and again, and in their constancy there is reassurance. Similarly, the ship's silence did not demand interpretation. It offered stillness, a pause in the relentless human habit of labeling and concluding. To listen was to sit beside the mystery rather than stand above it, to acknowledge that some stories are meant to be felt like a tide against the shore, familiar yet never fully grasped. In this listening, the Mary Celeste ceased to be lonely. She became accompanied by the sea itself, her silence harmonizing with its endless murmur. The ship's drift no longer felt aimless but aligned with a broader rhythm, one that did not prioritize destinations over movement. And perhaps this was the quiet truth the ocean had been offering all along, that meaning is not always found in answers, but in the willingness to remain present with questions. Listening required trust, a belief that understanding does not always arrive in the form we expect, and that peace can exist alongside uncertainty. As the waves continued their unhurried conversation with the hull, it became possible to imagine that the story had not ended abruptly, but had simply shifted into a quieter register, one that could only be heard by those willing to slow down enough to notice. The Mary Celeste, once an object of speculation, transformed into a reminder that the world is larger than our explanations, deeper than our narratives, and that sometimes the most honest response to mystery is not to speak over it, but to listen, and let the sea finish the sentence in its own time. In the end, the Mary Celeste did not demand to be understood, and it was this refusal, gentle, unwavering, that allowed her story to settle into something like rest, as though the ship herself had chosen sleep over explanation and invited those who followed her tale to do the same. Time, which had once seemed frozen aboard her decks, resumed its quiet work, sanding sharp questions into smoother shapes, until the mystery no longer pressed against the mind like a locked door but rested there like a familiar room left intentionally dim. The ship drifted into history not as a riddle to be cracked, but as a presence to be remembered, a reminder that some endings are not broken simply because they are open. In this final stillness, the sea reclaimed its role not as a witness but as a companion, carrying the memory of the Mary Celeste the way it carries everything else, with patience, without judgment, and with no obligation to explain. The ocean had always known what humans often forget, that silence is not empty, that rest can be an answer, and that not all journeys are measured by arrival. When night falls upon the water, the horizon dissolves and distinctions soften, and it is easy to imagine the ship there still, rocking gently beneath a sky that does not ask questions, her sails breathing lightly, her deck holding the echo of footsteps that no longer need to return. In sleep, the mind loosens its grip on certainty, and the story of the Mary Celeste becomes less about disappearance and more about release. The release of expectation, of narrative control, of the insistence that every mystery owes us closure. The ship keeps her sleep the way the sea keeps its depths, not hidden out of malice, but held because they are not meant to be emptied. There is a peculiar comfort in this, a calm that arrives when one accepts that understanding has limits, and that those limits are not failures but boundaries that protect wonder from being exhausted. The Mary Celeste rests within that boundary now, her silence intact, her order preserved not as evidence but as atmosphere, a still life drifting gently through collective memory. The unanswered questions no longer clamor. They breathe slowly, synchronized with the imagined sway of the hull, becoming part of a larger rhythm that asks nothing and offers peace. In this way, the story resolves without resolving, settling into the kind of ending that does not close a book so much as place a quiet marker between pages, allowing the reader to stop without feeling unfinished. The sea continues as it always has, carrying ships and storms and stories alike, and the Mary Celeste becomes one of its softer thoughts, a pause between waves, a reminder whispered rather than spoken. And as sleep approaches, as the mind drifts toward its own quiet waters, the ship's lesson lingers gently, that some mysteries are meant to be carried, not solved, that some silences are complete, and that there is rest to be found in letting a story remain exactly as it is, adrift, intact, and finally at peace.